My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. The world woke up to chaos. Stock markets trembled. Television anchors stumbled through breaking news, their voices quivering with disbelief. In the heart of Europe, investors watched billions vanish from their screens. The cause of it all wasn't a war, nor a natural disaster. It was a man. A single, stubborn man standing on African soil, Ibrahim Traoré. That morning, he had done something no one thought possible. With one declaration, he halted every foreign mining operation inside Burkina Faso. No warning, no negotiation, no compromise. Overnight, the flow of gold, the lifeblood of countless global corporations, stopped. The silence from the mines was louder than any explosion. Far away, men in tailored suits cursed under their breath. Meetings were called, statements drafted. "He'll change his mind," they said. "He's young. He'll learn." But they didn't understand the kind of conviction that had grown inside Traoré, the kind that comes from generations of humiliation. While the powerful panicked, he stood quietly on the edge of an abandoned mine. The morning light was pale, cutting across the dust. The pit stretched before him like a wound, a scar carved by foreign hands and left to rot. The machines were gone, the workers unpaid, the earth silent. Only the faint scent of oil and ash remained. A small boy watched him from a distance, his feet bare, his hands coated with mud. He was searching for scraps of gold dust left behind by those who had taken everything. The sight pierced through Traoré's chest. He had seen this his entire life, his people digging through ruins for fragments of their own stolen wealth. He turned to one of his guards and spoke quietly. "They left us nothing," he said. "Nothing but holes." And then, as if talking to the soil itself, he added, "But they'll pay for every grain they took." He wasn't a man of grand theatrics. His power was in stillness, a calm defiance that frightened those who mistook silence for weakness. That morning, under the vast Sahel sky, he set in motion something far greater than a political act. He declared war, not with weapons, but with truth. By noon, the news had reached every corner of the planet. Embassies called it madness. Economists called it suicide. But in the villages of Burkina Faso, it felt like dawn. Radios crackled to life as people gathered around them, some too stunned to speak. Others cried. For once, someone had dared to say the words they had whispered for generations. No more stealing our wealth. In Paris, the phones never stopped ringing. In Washington, reports were printed with red urgency stamps. And in London, a television anchor tried to stay composed as she read, "The President of Burkina Faso has ordered the immediate suspension of all foreign extraction licenses." Behind her calm voice, the world began to fracture. For decades, Burkina Faso's wealth had flowed in one direction, out. The mines were foreign-owned, the refineries foreign-run, the profits foreign-bound. What remained in the country was poverty, dependency, and silence. Every time someone tried to change that system, they disappeared. But Traoré wasn't built to disappear. He came from the dust, from the same hunger that haunted his people. A soldier who rose not by privilege, but by sheer defiance. He had fought in the north, seen villages burned by men with foreign weapons, seen the illusion of aid that came with chains attached. He carried the memory of Thomas Sankara in his heart, not as legend, but as warning. Sankara had dreamed of independence, and they killed him for it. Traoré had learned, freedom spoken too loudly becomes a target. So he stayed silent until he was ready to strike. The moment arrived when he uncovered a secret hidden deep within his nation's archives, a classified agreement between the previous government and international lenders. Buried inside the fine print was a promise. Half of Burkina Faso's gold exports would be used to pay debts that had already been settled decades ago. Signed by men who had long fled, witnessed by names that now held powerful positions in European trade councils. It wasn't just theft. It was betrayal scripted into law. That night, he didn't sleep. He read every line of that document until the ink blurred. By dawn, he had made his choice. The next day, he appeared on national television. The room was bare, no grand backdrop, no audience, just a desk, a flag, and a man who looked calm enough to terrify. His speech lasted less than 2 minutes. "My people," he said, "for generations we have worked the soil while others carried our gold away. We built the roads that took our wealth, not our freedom. Today, that ends." He paused. The silence was heavy. From this moment, all foreign mining operations are suspended. Our resources belong to our children, not their creditors. He ended the broadcast with a faint nod. No slogans, no applause. Only quiet, the kind that feels like the edge of a storm. Within hours, the world reacted. The IMF froze Burkina Faso's accounts. Corporate ambassadors demanded explanations. And behind closed doors, certain Western officials began drafting plans, not for negotiation, but for regime change. While the powerful scrambled, Traoré returned to his office, where stacks of reports awaited him: falling currency values, blocked imports, warnings from terrified ministers. The economy was bleeding before his eyes. Yet when his aides urged him to compromise, he simply replied, "What good is wealth if we don't own it?" The days that followed were hard. Electricity became unreliable, medicine scarce. The markets grew quiet. But in the villages, something stirred. Pride. Women began baking bread with local grain instead of imported flour. Miners refused to reopen foreign pits. Blacksmiths and carpenters, long forgotten, returned to work. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe hands were building, not begging. But beneath that fragile hope, shadows moved. Traoré's intelligence network began intercepting strange communications, encrypted messages between diplomats, businessmen, and mercenaries. Some spoke of economic containment, others of restructuring the leadership, a familiar pattern. He knew what came next: the isolation, the disinformation, the covert attempts to fracture his own army. He gathered his closest allies, old comrades from the military, men who had seen too much to be fooled by smiles from embassies. Together they began preparing for the storm they knew was coming. Each night, Traoré would return to his office long after midnight. The city outside would be dark, the streets empty. He'd stand at the window and look toward the horizon, the same horizon where his people still dug through dirt for flecks of gold they'd never see. He thought of Sankara, of how every great African dream had been cut short by bullets or betrayal. And he wondered if history was already sharpening its blade for him, but fear never showed on his face. He understood something most leaders didn't, that power isn't in possession, it's in refusal. The refusal to kneel, to accept, to surrender. And so, while the world plotted against him, he wrote a new decree, one that would soon be broadcast to every nation that thought Africa would forever bow. It was simple, almost poetic. Our wealth is ours. We will trade fairly, but never as slaves. Those who built empires from our soil will now answer for every grain they stole. When that message was released, the world froze again, and from that silence rose a truth that could no longer be buried. Africa was no longer asking. It was remembering who it was. The Western media called it rebellion. Burkina Faso called it justice, and Ibrahim Traoré, standing in the middle of that storm, smiled faintly, as if he could already hear the sound of chains breaking somewhere deep beneath the earth. The retaliation came quietly at first, an invisible war, the kind fought with currencies instead of bullets. Within days of Traoré's decree, the banks began to tighten their grip. Transfers froze, international credit vanished. Containers of fuel sat anchored at sea, denied entry. The price of bread tripled overnight. The markets, once loud with bargaining voices, fell silent. People lined up for hours under the scorching sun just to buy a single bag of rice. From the outside, it looked like an economy collapsing. From within, it felt like punishment. The West called it economic correction. The people knew better. It was vengeance. Every sanction, every delayed shipment. Every press release was designed to break one man's resolve, to make Traoré bend, to prove that no one could defy the corporate order and survive. And yet, he didn't bend. Each morning, he stood before his nation. His uniform pressed but simple, his tone calm. "We will endure," he told them. "Our dignity is not for sale." But as the weeks dragged on, that dignity began to feel like a heavy stone. Electricity flickered. Hospitals rationed medicine. Farmers complained that imported seeds were no longer arriving. The opposition grew louder. Men who once served under him now spoke on foreign-funded news channels, calling him a tyrant, leading the country into ruin. He knew many of their words weren't their own. He'd seen the money trails before, hidden behind development grants and consultancy programs. He'd watched how Western intelligence paid rebels and politicians alike to destabilize nations that dared to think independently. Still, it hurt, not because they called him a dictator, but because some of those voices belonged to people he once trusted. One night, as he read through another stack of reports detailing food shortages, his aide approached cautiously. "Sir," he said, "people are suffering. Maybe we should open negotiations, show we are willing to cooperate." Traoré looked up slowly. "Negotiate with thieves?" His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "You don't negotiate with those who've been robbing your house for 100 years. You change the locks." He dismissed the aide with a nod, then stared at the flickering light bulb above him. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of solitude. Leadership, he realized, was the loneliest form of war. But loneliness could be a weapon. He began forming a secret council, a small group of trusted economists, engineers, and soldiers. Not politicians, not elites, ordinary people with extraordinary loyalty. They met in silence, often under the cover of night, in an abandoned warehouse outside Ouagadougou. Their mission was not to survive sanctions. It was to outsmart them. If the world had cut them off, then they would build their own. Traoré's plan was simple but radical. A self-sufficient economy fueled by local production and regional alliances. He called it Project Rebirth. While his enemies thought he was cornered, he was rebuilding his nation from the ground up, in secret. But as Burkina Faso tried to breathe again, the invisible hands tightened around its throat. A month after the decree, an explosion rocked one of the largest state-owned mines. The blast killed 12 workers and halted production for weeks. The cause officially was equipment malfunction, but the report didn't convince anyone. The pattern was too familiar, covert sabotage disguised as accident. Traoré visited the site himself. The ground still smoldered, the smell of burnt metal in the air. He crouched beside the wreckage and sifted through the dirt with his bare hands. What he found made his blood run cold. A detonator engraved with a foreign manufacturer's code, one used exclusively by European contractors. He said nothing to the cameras. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes told the world that he understood exactly what was happening. That night, a power outage plunged the capital into darkness. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was message. Traoré lit a candle on his desk and began writing a letter, not to any government, but to his people. He wrote about endurance, about reclaiming what was stolen, about standing tall in the storm. When he finished, he leaned back and whispered to himself, "They will choke us slowly, thinking we'll surrender." But they forget. Hunger doesn't kill those who've lived with it their whole lives. The hunger did grow. Families rationed food, schools closed, and rumors spread of rebellion. Foreign media showed images of empty shelves, painting him as the architect of his nation's suffering. They never showed the other side, the warehouses full of gold bars that once left Burkina Faso every week. Now frozen by sanctions, they never showed the people who refused to betray him. One of them was a woman named Adiza, a miner's widow who led a growing movement among rural women, teaching them to mine, smelt and sell gold locally without foreign middlemen. Another was an engineer named Kader, who rebuilt an abandoned power station using scrap parts and old generators. Traoré visited them quietly, without cameras. He believed revolutions should be lived before they were televised. When he returned to the capital, he gathered his cabinet and said, "The world thinks we are weak because we are hungry. But they forget, the stomach that has known hunger can survive anything. We will not collapse. We will adapt." They began trading directly with neighboring nations. No banks, no intermediaries. Barter and trust replaced currency. It wasn't efficient, but it was freedom. Then came the mysterious envoy. A Western diplomat arrived in Ouagadougou under the guise of peace talks. He requested a private meeting. Against his advisor's protests, Traoré agreed. They met in a dimly lit room inside the old colonial governor's residence, a place heavy with history and irony. The diplomat smiled with the confidence of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. He offered relief packages, partnerships, and technical aid. In exchange, Traoré was to restore foreign investor access to the mines. He even slid a sealed envelope across the table, an unspoken bribe dressed in politeness. Traoré didn't touch it. He only stared at the man and asked, "When your country stole from us for decades, where were your relief packages then?" The diplomat hesitated. "That's not how the world works, President Traoré," he smiled faintly. "No," he said, "that's how your world works." He stood up and walked away, leaving the envelope unopened. Later that night, he received intelligence that the envoy wasn't a diplomat at all. He was a liaison for a multinational consortium whose profits had plummeted since the decree. A corporate spy dressed as a peacemaker, and Traoré understood they weren't negotiating peace. They were testing his limits. The following weeks turned darker. Anonymous threats appeared in his office. His personal driver was found dead outside the city, the scene staged to look like robbery. He stopped sleeping in the same place twice. Even his closest guards didn't know his exact movements. But if fear was meant to silence him, it had the opposite effect. He began appearing in public more often, walking among miners, visiting farmers, shaking hands with people who'd lost everything. The sight of him, alive and unbroken, fueled a quiet kind of rebellion. When the IMF declared Burkina Faso a non-cooperative state, ordinary citizens responded by painting walls with slogans, "If justice is defiance, we will all be defiant." Across Africa, his message began to spread. Other nations watched closely, some secretly inspired, others terrified. For every leader who condemned him on television, there were two who sent private letters of respect. The West began to realize this was no longer a Burkinabe problem. It was an idea spreading like fire. Then came the document leak. Late one evening, Traoré received a secure call from his intelligence chief. A data breach had occurred at a European banking network. Thousands of confidential files exposing secret transfers between Western corporations and African ministers. Among them, dozens of transactions tied to Burkina Faso's past governments. Millions in bribes, billions in unreported profits. The leak went public. And for the first time, the world saw in cold numbers what Traoré had been fighting against. The reaction was explosive. Protests erupted not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. People demanded accountability. Young activists marched through cities carrying his portrait, chanting, "Our wealth is ours." Corporate shares plummeted. Investors panicked. And inside the quiet offices of international agencies, panic turned to anger. They had underestimated him. But victory never comes without sacrifice. The next morning, a convoy transporting supplies to the northern provinces was ambushed. Dozens of soldiers killed. The attackers left no insignia, no claim of responsibility. But the weapons, marked with foreign serial numbers, told the story. Traoré stood beside the burned trucks, the wind whipping through his uniform. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, to the officer beside him, "This is what freedom costs." That night he convened his council again. He spoke to them not as president, but as a soldier. "They believe we will break," he said. They think hunger and fear will divide us. But what they don't understand is that we are already united by pain. They've taken everything they could. Now they're fighting ghosts. He looked around the table, his face hard, eyes unwavering. Let them come. The world is watching, and when this is over, they'll know that Burkina Faso didn't just survive. It changed the rules. Outside, the air was heavy with dust. In the distance, thunder rolled across the horizon. The rains were coming, slow, distant, inevitable. Children played in the streets, barefoot, their laughter echoing through the narrow alleys. Mothers cooked what little they had. Men repaired old tools, preparing for another day. Life went on, stubborn, fragile, but alive. And somewhere above it all, Ibrahim Traoré watched from his office window. His country was suffering, yes, but suffering had always been Africa's language, and he was rewriting its grammar. In the depths of the night, he whispered to himself, "They're starving us to prove we can't stand. But we'll show them. We can stand even when we fall." He turned away from the window and faced the map on the wall. The borders glowed faintly under the lamplight. He didn't see lines of division. He saw possibilities, a future built not by foreign loans, but by African hands. And though the storm outside grew louder, his voice remained steady, quiet, unbroken. Because somewhere beneath that same storm, a nation was beginning to believe again. The storm had become routine now, sanctions, propaganda, sabotage. Every day a new attack, every week a new crisis. Yet somehow Traoré's resolve only grew stronger, sharper, forged by the very pressure meant to destroy him. But he knew that pride alone could not feed a nation. Hope could not power generators. Dignity could not fill an empty stomach. The balance between survival and sovereignty was thinning, and the world was watching, waiting for him to fall. In the shadows of the capital, the whispers grew louder. Mercenaries spotted near the borders, foreign agents recruiting local militias, strange drones appearing above mining zones at night. The invisible war was about to turn physical. Traoré stood before his military council, hands clasped behind his back. The map before them glowed with red markers, areas of unrest, each one a spark waiting to ignite. "They want chaos," he said quietly. "They think if they break our order, we'll beg them for help. But we don't beg," he pointed to the map. "We rebuild, faster, smarter, unseen." Then, for the first time since the decree, he authorized a covert response, Operation Nimba. It wasn't a counterattack in the traditional sense. There would be no open confrontation, no armies marching. It was a war of information, economy, and willpower. Traoré understood that the greatest weapon in the modern world wasn't a gun, it was truth. The plan began in silence. Hackers within the military intelligence unit infiltrated corporate networks across Europe, tracing hidden accounts and fake NGOs funneling money into Africa. The evidence was damning, not just exploitation, but collusion. Politicians, media executives, and CEOs, all linked in a web of profit built from African resources. One night, Traoré received the files on a secure drive. As he opened them, line after line of transactions appeared on screen. Gold, oil, lithium, all extracted under development projects. Billions drained through loopholes while African children studied under candlelight. He didn't rage. He only stared at the numbers, cold and silent. Then he said, "Expose it." Within 24 hours, the leak hit the global networks. Anonymous accounts began dropping documents online. Bank statements, contracts, communications. Screens across the world lit up with the proof of decades-long theft. And once again, the world trembled. Western leaders scrambled to contain the fallout. News channels called it the African Papers. Public outrage spread like wildfire. Even within the West, citizens began questioning their corporations. Stocks plummeted. Lawsuits multiplied. Traoré had struck the empire not with bullets, but with data. But victory came with a price. A few nights later, a convoy carrying humanitarian aid to a remote province vanished without a trace. No distress call, no survivors, only tire tracks leading into the desert. It was a message: retaliation for humiliation. Traoré sat alone that night, staring at the radio reports. His hand trembled for the first time, not from fear but from exhaustion. He had expected resistance, but not this level of cruelty. He stood up, walked to the balcony, and looked over Ouagadougou. The city was half dark, half alive. He could hear the distant hum of generators, the faint laughter of children who still found joy in nothingness. And he realized the people hadn't abandoned him. Even with everything collapsing, they still believed. That faith was now his armor. He turned back to his desk and began writing again, this time a broadcast. Not for the West, not for the elites, for Africa. When he spoke the next morning, his voice was tired, but unbreakable. They have tried to starve us, to silence us, to shame us. But they forget that Africa was never built by comfort. It was built by endurance. We will not kneel. We will not sell. We will not stop. The words echoed far beyond his borders. In Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Niger, leaders began echoing his tone. New trade alliances formed quietly in hotel basements and embassy backrooms. Contracts once written in French or English began appearing in Swahili and Arabic. The old order was shaking. The corporations tried to adapt, rebranding themselves, sending African-friendly envoys, promising equal partnerships. But no one believed them anymore. The illusion was broken. The African continent was waking up. Still, the empire didn't sleep. A private military company, funded through intermediaries, launched coordinated attacks on communication towers in the north. The goal was clear: destabilize, isolate, and delegitimize the government. The sound of explosions tore through the night sky. Traoré rushed to the operations center. "Secure the capital," he ordered. "Evacuate civilians." He grabbed a radio. "To the people of Burkina Faso, do not be afraid. We are under attack, but not defeated. Every generation must fight its battle. This one is ours." His words became a rallying cry. Soldiers who had once doubted him now fought fiercely. Farmers picked up rifles. Women formed supply chains, smuggling food and medicine through rural roads. It wasn't just a military defense. It was a nation's heartbeat. Days turned into weeks. The fighting slowed, but the tension didn't. The mercenaries withdrew after heavy losses, leaving behind scorched land but not victory. And in the silence that followed, something remarkable happened. For the first time in decades, the country began to rebuild without foreign contracts. Local engineers repaired the power grid using recycled parts. Mechanics turned old military trucks into transport vehicles for goods. Farmers organized cooperative systems, trading directly with urban communities. What had begun as survival slowly became independence. Traoré watched it unfold like a miracle, not from grand speeches, but from the quiet strength of ordinary people. "This," he said softly to his minister one evening, "is how real revolutions look, not with fireworks, but with calloused hands." But the world still doubted. Western media portrayed the recovery as propaganda. Think tanks claimed the Traoré experiment was unsustainable. They predicted total collapse within months. Instead, Burkina Faso's economy began showing signs of life. Small, slow, but real. The mining sector stabilized. The currency held. Exports resumed under new regional agreements. And while global investors hesitated, something unexpected happened. Young Africans abroad started returning home. Engineers, doctors, programmers, tired of being undervalued overseas, came back to build something that felt their own. For the first time, the nation's airports were crowded not with those leaving, but those returning. Traoré watched them step off the planes, carrying laptops, dreams, and a stubborn belief that home was worth fighting for. That night, he told his council, "They thought they isolated us. Instead, they reminded us who we are." The turning point came when a group of Pan-African leaders secretly met in Bamako. They drafted a regional charter, one that proposed a shared defense, a unified trade policy, and a new digital currency backed by real resources, not foreign debt. When Traoré read the document, he smiled for the first time in months. "This is it," he whispered. "The beginning of what they feared most. An Africa that no longer asks for permission." News of the meeting leaked, of course. Western headlines called it a dangerous populist alliance. But for Africans, It felt like prophecy. Across the continent, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, not as a dictator, but as a symbol. A man who had dared to say no. But he was not naive. He knew revolutions often devoured their heroes. He knew the cost of defiance. One evening, as he walked through the palace garden, his security chief approached him. "Sir, intelligence reports chatter about an assassination plot. They've placed a bounty." Traoré nodded. "Let them try." The officer frowned. "You should move to a safer location." He shook his head. "If I hide, they've already won." He looked up at the night sky, quiet, infinite, uncaring, and said softly, "History doesn't protect those who play safe. It remembers those who didn't run." A week later, he addressed the nation again, this time from a humble open-air stage surrounded by thousands. No bulletproof glass, no teleprompter, just a microphone, a flag, and a man unafraid. "My people," he began, his voice echoing through the crowd. "We were told that we cannot exist without them, that our freedom is impossible without their permission. But today, look around you. We stand, we breathe, we live. They said we would starve, yet here we are, still standing." The crowd roared. He raised his fist. "Africa's story has been written by others for too long. Now we write our own, with sweat, not pity, with courage, not compromise." Cheers erupted, filling the air with thunder. The sound carried across the capital, through the villages, and beyond the borders. In that moment, it no longer felt like one man against the world. It felt like a continent finding its voice. As the sun set behind the horizon, painting the city in gold and crimson, Traoré stood silently, watching the people disperse. Children waved flags, women sang, men cried quietly, not from sadness, but from something deeper, pride. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Let them come again. This time, we'll be ready." For the first time in generations, Africa wasn't asking for liberation. It was declaring it. And though the empire still plotted in boardrooms and embassies, something irreversible had already begun. A shift not of power, but of spirit. Because the world could sanction borders, freeze assets, and spread lies, but it could never sanction an idea whose time had come. The night the sky changed color over Ouagadougou, no one slept. The explosion started at 2:17 a.m., not loud enough to destroy, but precise enough to send a message. A communication tower in the city's outskirts was struck by an unknown drone. Flames climbed into the clouds, orange against black. Within minutes, the capital went dark, and in the silence that followed, the fear returned. The same cold fear that had haunted the country for generations. By dawn, international news agencies were already framing it as internal unrest. Some even claimed rebels had risen again. But Traoré knew better. This wasn't rebellion, it was retaliation. He stood in the dim light of his operations room, surrounded by his generals, his face expressionless. The reports came in. Coordinated cyber attacks on national servers, anonymous calls threatening military intervention, mysterious movements along the northern border. The world had decided to remind him of his place. But Traoré was no longer the young officer who once hesitated to challenge orders. He had learned that the empire never forgives defiance and never stops testing it. He turned to his staff. "They want panic," he said. "Give them silence." The order was simple: blackout. No press statements, no retaliation, no visible reaction. Let the world wonder what Burkina Faso was planning. For 72 hours, there was nothing but quiet. And then, without warning, Traoré appeared live on state television. The backdrop was black. The flag behind him hung motionless. "My fellow Africans," he began, his voice steady. "They have bombed our land, hacked our systems, and called us rebels on our own soil. But let them know this: we are not rebels. We are the rightful owners of this continent." He paused. the silence heavier than the smoke outside. They take our gold, our oil, our children's futures, and call it aid. They drain our soil and sell it back to us as debt. They steal, then label us thieves. But from this day, I will no longer ask them to stop. I will make them. The transmission was only 5 minutes long, but within those minutes, the balance of fear shifted. Across Africa, the words ignited something invisible but unstoppable: resolve. In the coming days, the corporate retaliation grew ruthless. Burkina Faso's trade routes were blocked, its bank reserves frozen, imports halted. The media called it economic isolation. In truth, it was warfare without weapons. Factories shut down. Pharmacies ran out of medicine. Prices tripled overnight. In the markets, mothers argued over bread. Teachers went unpaid. Soldiers ate less but fought harder. The country was bleeding, not from bullets, but from sanctions. One night, as he walked through a dimly lit hospital, Traoré stopped beside a mother holding her malnourished child. The doctor whispered, "We have nothing left to give." Traoré knelt beside her and said softly, "He will live." The woman didn't answer. She just stared at him, not as a president, but as the man who had chosen pride over comfort. When he left, he didn't cry. But that night, for the first time, he doubted himself. Was freedom worth this suffering? He looked at his reflection in the window, the city lights flickering like dying stars, and whispered to himself, "They broke Sankara with fear. They'll not break me with hunger." In a distant boardroom, a different scene unfolded. 12 men sat around a polished oak table. The walls were covered in maps of Africa marked with red zones. One of them, a former diplomat turned corporate strategist, spoke coldly. "He's not just challenging our companies, he's changing the narrative. If this spreads, our entire influence collapses." Another nodded. "Then we make him disappear quietly." Operation Sable Noir was authorized, a covert plan to remove Traoré, destabilize the nation, and reinstate a compliant government. It was to be executed not by soldiers, but by shadows, mercenaries, intelligence operatives, and local informants. The plan was foolproof, except it wasn't. Burkina Faso had changed. The people had eyes everywhere. The whispers of betrayal were no longer ignored. They were hunted. A week before the operation's launch, one of Traoré's guards intercepted a message from an encrypted satellite phone. The details were clear. The attempt would come during his next public event. When Traoré was informed, he didn't flinch. "Let them come," he said. "Let them see what happens when the hunted no longer runs." The day of the attack arrived hot and dusty. He was scheduled to speak in front of thousands at the old Independence Square, an event commemorating Burkina Faso's economic sovereignty. Foreign journalists were invited. Drones hovered. The world watched. Traoré stepped onto the stage dressed in his military uniform, the same red beret that had become a symbol of defiance resting on his head. He began to speak slowly, deliberately. "We were told Africa was too weak to stand alone. But every empire that called us weak now fears our awakening. They steal from us because they know what we could become." The crowd roared, and then chaos. A sharp sound cracked through the air, the first bullet. The crowd screamed, scattering in panic. Traoré didn't move. His guards surrounded him instantly, forming a human wall. Another shot, then another. The shooter never stood a chance. He was taken down within seconds, a foreign mercenary, face hidden beneath a mask, identity erased. But the message was clear. They wanted fear to return. Instead, they got fury. Traoré grabbed the microphone, his voice booming through the smoke and confusion. "They think bullets can silence truth. They think death will scare us back into chains. But I tell you, we are not afraid of dying. We are afraid of forgetting who we are." The crowd erupted again, louder than before. The panic turned to rage. the fear into resolve. People stood their ground. Thousands raised fists in defiance. In that moment, the assassination attempt became the exact opposite of what it was meant to be. Not the end of a movement, but its consecration. The next day, every newspaper in Africa carried the same image. Traoré, defiant, standing on the stage surrounded by smoke. The headline read, "They tried to kill the voice of Africa and failed." Western networks called it chaos. African hearts called it resurrection. And for the first time in history, nations that had remained silent began to speak. Mali announced full solidarity. Niger followed. Guinea declared an immediate review of foreign contracts. Then Chad, Togo, and Senegal joined the chorus. In less than a month, an alliance was born, the Pan-African Coalition for Sovereignty. Their first declaration was as bold as it was simple. No foreign entity shall own African soil. Traoré had lit the spark. The continent was now fire. But even revolutions cast long shadows. The retaliation grew darker. Anonymous threats flooded embassies. Aid organizations withdrew, claiming security concerns. Western leaders condemned the authoritarian turn in Africa, pretending not to see that it was freedom taking shape. And yet, beneath the chaos, a quiet miracle unfolded. The Pan-African Coalition launched its own trade platform, a digital system for resource exchange that bypassed traditional banks. Gold, lithium, and oil were now traded directly between African nations using a new digital unit called the Sankara credit. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that single act shattered the last illusion of dependency.